Good afternoon, everybody. I am Giorgio Barba Navaretti, and I am the president of Collegio Carlo Alberto and the director of Centro Studi Luca. And I'm really pleased to open the floor today. This is our fifth annual conference of our Migration Observatory that we do every year, and which is coordinated by Tommaso Frattini, that will chair the first section and will appear on your screens very, very soon. This is an initiative that is jointly organized by Collegio Carlo Alberto and the Centro Studi Luca, and also in collaboration with FIERI. And we are pleased to have Ferruccio Pastore with us, who is the director of FIERI. And actually, this is an initiative that, as many of you know, is funded by the Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo. I think that the program today is extremely interesting. We have, as usual, a twofold program. The first part, the first two sessions will be essentially academic papers. And then the last session will be Tommaso Frattini presenting the report of the Migration Observatory, that it's more descriptive data, essentially. And usually, as you know, the report usually repeats every year and looks at data coming from the most recent statistics at the EU level and at the Italian level of the integration of migrants in the labor market. Now, this is what we will be doing, but also this year, most of the work of this conference is devoted to the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdowns essentially on immigrants in the labor market. So the papers all the papers will be on this subject, and also the monographic part of the report will be on this subject. And as you will see, results are pretty interesting, even though a little bit worrying, I would say. I think this is a very timely initiative. This is a very difficult moment, I would say, for everybody, but certainly for the migrant community in Europe and in general is especially hard. And as we'll see, the impact for them on their outcomes in the labor market is especially fierce. So I'm really happy that we managed to put together this panel and this set of interesting papers on this, and to complete the report on this, even though, of course, the data we have are not we don't have such a long series. I think we get to the mid of 2020, but still we have interesting results. And I have to thank Tommaso for organizing this report, writing the report, and organizing this conference. And of course, Chiara Elli of the Centro Studi Luca, who carried out all the organization of the panel, and all the team at the Collegio Carlo Alberto that did a wonderful job as usual. So I don't think I have much more to say. The only thing I would like to say is that the chair of the paper will read your questions. There is a question and answer session on the bottom part of your screen in your Zoom program. It's D and R for the Italians, Q&A for all the rest of the world. For the rest of the world, you can simply write your question, and who chairs the session will essentially read it and to the author at the end of the presentation, I would say. So Tommaso Frattini chairs the first session, and Ferruccio Pastore will chair the second session. The first one is on the labor market, and the second one is on mental health and attitudes. So without any further ado, Tommaso, I leave you the floor, and welcome, and go ahead. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Giorgio. I also want to extend my thanks to Chiara Elli and to the whole staff at Collegio Carlo Alberto for organizing this conference. And of course, I'd like to thank all the speakers that have accepted our invitation today. So as Giorgio has said, this year we have decided to focus our annual conference on the topic of immigration and COVID-19. So every year we organize a conference where we have a presentation of academic papers from scholars from different disciplinary backgrounds that, however, have some policy relevant implications. Okay, so and this year, somehow the natural theme seemed to be COVID-19. And I think we have managed to put together a very interesting set of presentations that will look at the effect that the pandemic has had on immigrants under from a very different point of views and from very complementary point of views. Giorgio has already anticipated the rules, so the audience can ask questions through the Q&A or D&R window that you have in Zoom, and the chair of this session, so in this case it would be me, will collect the questions and ask them to the speakers at the end of their presentations. Given that the time is very tight, we will not ask questions during the presentation, so we let speakers speak for 20 minutes, and then we leave the last 5 minutes for questions. I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say, and then of course I will say something more at the end of the academic session of this conference when I will present some key findings of our annual report. So I'm very pleased to open this first session on labor market, and the first speaker is Martin Ruhs, who is a professor of migration studies at the European University Institute, and we talk about COVID-19 and systemic resilience. So Martin, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for participating.
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you, Tommaso, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I will share my screen. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay. So I will talk. My talk is based on a working paper that's joined with Bridget Anderson at Bristol University and Friedrich Pöschel, who until recently was here at the European University Institute. And the paper is meant to be kind of a concept paper that lays out what we think is a new research agenda, or elements of a new research agenda motivated by the outbreak of COVID-19 and the many policy debates that we have seen since then. And it comes, it starts with the question, it starts with the observation that in many essential services, we have significant numbers of migrants employed. And as many people have been pointing out, migrants have played an important role in making sure that these essential services are kept going. But it ties back, of course, this is not a new question, to what extent there is a need for migrant workers. So in a way, what we do is that we have a long-standing interest in this question about the role of migrants in addressing labor and skills shortages in high-income countries in particular. As many of you will know, there's been not only significant policy debate about this, but also a significant number of research about how you might want to go about addressing these questions. But by and large, when we think about labor migration policies in high-income countries, we're mostly discussing efficiency and distribution. So by that I mean, what are the economic impacts of admitting migrants with particular skills on particular sectors and the economy as a whole, and maybe what are the fiscal impacts, and then who benefits and who loses from that. And what we are arguing is that with COVID, what we see is a new concern and potential new questions, certainly policy questions, but these questions could also translate it into interesting research questions. And basically the question is how migrant labor shapes the resilience of the provision of essential goods and services during the pandemic now, but also during similar future shocks. And how does that vary across countries with different institutions and policies? So again, as I said, we've had the long-standing question of, do we need migrant workers? What are impacts? mainly to do with efficiency distribution, but now we have this new question, I think, that's to do with resilience. And what we try to do is to kind of bring in some of the ideas that have developed in other disciplines, so not in migration studies, but in other disciplines, ideas about resilience, and try to integrate them with some ideas that we have already been working with in labor migration. So bring those two pieces of literature together. And in terms of policy, the question obviously is whether, when you think about resilience, labor migration resilience, whether that means that you need to rethink the impacts of migration and potentially also policy making. So I'll spend about 10 minutes or so trying to go through some of these elements. But again, the aim is to begin to lay out and propose new lines of research that address this question, the relationship between the employment of migrants and resilience of essential services. So again, we're not starting from zero. There's been a lot of work on the role of migrants in particular sectors. Most labor immigration policies in high-income countries are temporary migration policies, and one of the key policy questions is, how do you link the admission of migrants to the needs of the domestic labor market? Now, as we all know, economists don't particularly like the word need, and you have to be clear what exactly is meant by that. But when you ask the question, is there a particular need for X number of migrant workers in a specific sector, in agriculture, in health services, in social care? And if so, what skill level are we talking about? There's a lot of debate about what skills means. The definition of skills is very contentious. People talk about hard versus soft skills. So hard skills are the ones that are easy to measure and credentialized. Soft skills like team working skills, customer handling skills. There's a big literature around employer demand for different types of skills and different types of migrant workers, particularly in economic sociology, and also quite a bit of qualitative research around that. Now, of course, there's no universal definition of a shortage either. So when it comes to the question how you measure shortages, employers often, when they talk about shortages, they mean a shortage of workers at current prevailing wages. Of course, that goes against the idea of a kind of basic textbook model of labor economics, where we like to think that shortages are responsive are dependent on wages. And of course, there's no single optimal policy response. Even if we agree there's a particular shortage in a particular sector, there's no one single optimal policy response. There might be a range of alternatives. Immigration might be one, mechanization, computerization might be another, offshoring if that is possible. And there are debates about how one should respond to a shortage, which of course is in some way always a political question. So whether the best response is rising wages or immigration or mechanization, that in part is a normative question, and it's a political question. What we do know from existing research, however, is that these employer demand for migrant workers and these shortages don't arise in a vacuum, and they are critically influenced by wider institutions and policies, what Bridget Anderson and I have called system effects. And these wider institutions and policies that influence employer demand for migrant workers often have little to do with immigration itself. So, for example, the most obvious example is that if you don't have a proper training system, vocational training system for construction workers, then obviously you will have a demand for migrants who are better trained. If you have a social care sector that is underfunded and there's a structural demand on low-cost minimum wage labor, then if you're in a flexible labor market, you're also likely to have a high demand for migrant workers. So basically, the labor demand for migrants is critically influenced by wider institutions and policies, welfare policies, labor market policies, housing policies. These vary across countries. Hence, you have different types of labor demand for migrants across different types of labor market regimes, welfare regimes, and so on. And as I said, there's been quite a bit of research around this inescapable politics of labor and skills shortages. So this is not, in a way, a kind of a simple technocratic question where you kind of can simply use a bunch of indicators and and say that we have shortages here or there, and that is being done, and we have done that. And for example, in the UK, in the Migration Advisory Committee, that's the job partly, to use labor market analysis to identify where there are shortages. But then the question is, what's the most sensible response? And that inherently is a normative political question. And as I said, most of the time when we think about these kinds of labor migration policy questions, we're talking about ideas about efficiency and distribution. So typically, labor migration policies or debates about labor migration policies ask the questions, what are going to be the economic impacts of this? As I said, what are the alternatives? Who are the winners and losers? Now, during COVID-19, one of the prime policy concerns immediately, of course, was how can we protect the provision of essential services? Healthcare, food production, social care, and so on. And of course, we know that in some of these services, we have significant numbers of migrants, but again, there's variation across countries. So I think that does raise the question, how migration shapes systemic resilience in different essential sectors across countries. And again, there's various different definitions of systemic resilience, but basically the idea is that the question is how quickly a system bounces back or even bounces forward from a particular shock. So the OECD has defined resilience as the ability to withstand, recover from, and adapt to unexpected external shocks. And we know from research that there are at least two kind of characteristics of systemic systems. One is flexibility. So how flexible is the system? To what extent do you rely on very rigid structures, or to what extent can you respond quickly to new circumstances? And secondly, social capital or networks. So that is about how interconnected is the system, how strong are the ties that can then respond to systemic shocks. And of course, all of that is influenced by policy making. So institutions and policies can either support or undermine flexibility, for example, labor market flexibility, the ability of workers to respond quickly, and ability of employers to respond to new situations. And institutional policy environment can also respond, undermine or support networks and social structures. So in a way, the question then arises, to what extent the employment of migrants can influence these things? And before I go kind of in some of the comparative research that we think might be interesting, I think that here's kind of four broad points that I think thinking about systemic resilience makes us shift our focus a little bit from the conventional way of thinking about things based on efficiency and distribution. So I think if you take seriously this idea that labor immigration policy should not only be driven by efficiency distribution, but also by the goal of having systemic resilience, I think it does shift the focus a little bit from talking about specific occupations and skill groups to transnational systems. So what do I mean by that is, again, typically in labor immigration policy debates, what you have is that people ask, is there a need for workers in agriculture to do strawberry picking? Or is there a need for IT specialists? Or is there a need for nurses? But when you think about resilience, we're talking about systems. So resilience can be achieved in many different ways. It's not only through domestic provision, domestic production. Resilience also depends on global international supply chains, potentially also on imports. So for example, in terms of the resilience of the health system, Malaysia is one of the world's biggest producers of medical gloves that a lot of high-income countries were importing. And Malaysia uses a lot of migrant workers producing those gloves. So I think if you're concerned about the resilience of your health system and about the availability of medical equipment and supplies, you're not only thinking about employment relations and migrants, their role in your own country, but also along the global labor supply chain or even in origin countries. So I think that there's a shift to systems of production and service provision that links different countries together rather than focusing on just the receiving country. A second point, this is just an observation. maybe concern with resilience takes away a little bit from traditional concerns about distribution among the domestic residents. So as we said before, a key issue is often to make sure that immigration doesn't harm domestic workers, especially the lowest earning ones. There's a political imperative, obviously, to that. But again, if you think about resilience, systemic resilience, especially across countries, that the ends might become more important than the means. So opposition to labor immigration might potentially be lower if labor migration takes on that additional role of ensuring systemic resilience. So I think it shifts the focus on the outcome rather than how systemic resilience is brought about in terms of the migrant-native mix. I think obviously a lot of politicians are concerned about the short term. How can we address shortages in the short term? It's harder to do long-term thinking. But again, resilience makes us think about the longer run. And maybe this is a window of opportunity where there's also some political space to open up these debates. And as I said, these are inherently political issues. So this is obviously not just an economic question, but it's about the politics of labor immigration. And the question is, can we go beyond efficiency and distribution? And in a way, this is an open question, of course. So I would argue that this is an opportunity where this idea of systemic resilience as an additional policy goal might enter debates and policy making in a serious way, and that opens up a lot of questions about research. But of course, we can't be sure that this will actually happen. We like to think, I think that the world will change, everything will be very different, and that might be the case. But we might also be prone to going back to the old ways, and maybe politically the thinking will switch back to conventional ways of thinking about this. So just briefly to conclude, what kinds of questions could one ask about the relationship between migrants and systemic resilience? And I think, these are just three types of questions, I think, that are interesting and that we're trying to pursue in the Migration and Systemic Resilience Hub that we're developing here at the Migration Policy Center at the EUI. The first question is, the first line of research would basically compare, so these are all comparative, it's all comparative research, obviously. You compare migrants and citizens employed within the same system. Because resilience obviously is not only determined by migrants or even by citizen workers, but it's critically determined by institutions and policies. So the resilience of a health system obviously depends critically on how the health system is designed, how it's funded, and all of that. But one line of research would ask, well, within a given system, say within the social care system in Italy or within the food production system of the UK, what can you say about migrants versus citizens? Because you can easily see how migrants might have particular characteristics and they might have particular circumstances precisely because they're migrants. That might mean that they're more or less flexible or that they might have stronger or weaker networks. So obviously migrants, it depends on migration flows. So if borders are closed, that affects labor supply. If you're talking about longer term migration, we're talking about constraints imposed by immigration status. Are migrants able to change jobs? Do they have access to doctors if they need them? Are they more likely to fall sick or less likely? We know about the healthy migrant effect, that migrants tend to be younger. Does that mean they're more likely to stay in employment during a crisis, and so on? I think there's lots of interesting questions one could ask about how migrants affect the provision of services during crisis. But then the second line of research, I think, is equally important, which is you basically compare migrants' roles across systems. So what I mean by that is that you might have different systems for providing the same kind of service across different countries. So the way social care is organized in Sweden, Denmark, the UK, and Italy is very different. That's because there's different institutions and policies. And these different institutions and different policies have implications for how many and what types of migrants are employed in these sectors. So one question to ask would be, how do these differently designed systems, how do they fare under crisis? So I think in that case, you compare migrants' roles within different types of systems. And the third question that I'm quite interested in as well is more of a kind of political economy question. So how do countries respond to COVID in terms of their essential services. So, I mean, one response, you might feel that migrants support or undermine resilience, so there might be a response within the given system. You might keep the current structure, but you might change the input mix, so to speak. You might think that we need more migrants to be flexible workers, or you might think we have to organize the work slightly differently. But the second way of responding is to say, no, it's not really about the kind of type of employment, about migration, it's about the system as a whole. We switch to a different system. So maybe in Britain, people say, well, our social care system that's dependent on rock bottom minimum wage labor is not the most resilient setup. We're going to change our structures and policies to switch to a completely different type of system. So the determinants of these choices, obviously, again, political determinants are quite interesting. Obviously, there are material costs and benefits involved. There are interest groups. But I think that's going to be quite interesting to study. How are different countries responding to the crisis in terms of strengthening the resilience of their essential services? Is there a migration response, or is there other type of response, or of course a mix of the two? All right, I think my time is up. I think I'll finish here. So I said, if you're interested, I'd encourage you to go to the website where we're trying to develop this hub, as we call it now. There's a large number of short contributions. If you're interested in making contributions, please get in touch. But the idea now is to start a discussion about these issues and to kind of collaboratively work up a research agenda. And then, of course, as soon as good data become available, to start doing some comparative research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Martin. And I think this is so you're raising a lot of very interesting research questions, and I think also this is a very nice presentation that poses a lot of issues, touches upon a lot of issues that then will be touched by the next papers to be presented. And so there is a question from the audience, and by the way, I again reiterate, if you want to ask questions to the speakers, you can type your question in the Q&A window, and then the speakers can read them themselves, but also we read them aloud. So the first question is related to the concept of resilience. So resilience as a concept has been used for many different projects. To achieve what you want, would it be better to speak of collaborative resilience, in that it opens up new ways of including migrants with the notion of the public good? So that's a question. Another question that, so if there are no other questions from the audience, I have a question myself. And so if I understand correctly, this concept of resilience, it is in some sense a way of switching the focus from a short-term to a longer-run perspective. But what you, if I get correctly, what you're saying is that if we could switch the narrative, I mean, if we could bring this perspective of this longer-run perspective into the migration policy discourse, that could be another angle to tackle the issue. But on the other hand, I was thinking that, especially with reference to the UK that you've mentioned a few times, right? So if you think about the NHS is heavily dependent on foreign workforce, on foreign professionals, both as nurses and doctors. On the other hand, in the long run, this could be overcome by training more nurses and doctors domestically. So in some sense, so migration can be a good response to short-term shocks, because you can easily open up the borders to workers that you need just now. But in the longer run, you could decide and train your workers domestically, and that actually makes you more immune from potential shocks that prevent mobility in the long run. Okay, so I'm wondering whether there's a tension between these two aspects.
Yeah, thank you, Tommaso. These are really both good questions. I'll start with the second one, with your question first. So yes, I think this idea of systemic resilience, if we think about it seriously in the context of migration, I think it has the potential to encourage some debates that many people have been reluctant to engage in. So yes, you're right, immigration is often a short-term response, but that raises more longer-run questions. So as you say, I mean, the UK is probably a good example, how their domestic training systems are not linked up with immigration policy very often. And of course, we know from research as well that the choice of technology can be endogenous, partly dependent on factory supplies. So what I think this kind of moment does or could do is force more explicit debates about this issue. So, okay, if we all agree that we want resilient systems, I mean, is it really good? Is it a good idea to carry on with the current way in which social care or health services are provided or health services are funded? And if so, if we think that is a good idea, that has then some implications for immigration policy. I think so we know from past research that research migration is connected to lots of other things, labor markets, welfare states, but in debates, we don't get these connections. I think thinking about resilience does force you to make these connections much more than people have been willing to do in the past. So yes, so for a long time, people have asked questions. Does the easy availability of migrant workers undermine employer incentives for training? Does it undermine mechanization? Or does it support these things? And so I think the tension between the short run and long run has always been there. What I'm suggesting that this additional goal might focus minds at least a little bit more to discuss these issues and do these tensions more explicitly. And the first question is a really good question as well in terms of so what do we mean by resilience? And it's correct to say that, of course, resilience has been used in lots of different ways. So one issue that we've had to engage with, and I mean, people who work on this will know this very well. Obviously, for a long time, we've been talking about individual resilience, individuals' resilience, especially in the development literature. And I mean, this idea that in a way we have to encourage individual resilience is loaded in the sense it often comes with a particular ideology and with a particular political approach. And I suppose the critique of some of these resilience approaches is that, well, why are we talking about resilience? Why are we not kind of addressing the root causes? Why are we not kind of trying to make sure that whatever it is, the crisis doesn't occur again? So in this case, what we are saying is that we're not talking about individual resilience. We're talking about resilience of systems. And the reasons why this is important is that future crises are very likely to happen. So we're not saying that we shouldn't try to prevent future crises or medical pandemic shocks or similar, but some of these crises are going to be outside our control. And therefore, it's important to think more systematically how our socioeconomic systems can be more resilient. Now, I agree. I mean, there is definitely room to. I mean, you can write a whole paper about what's the best way of thinking about systemic resilience. But the point again is that migrants can contribute to that in many ways. But there might also be ways in which particular employment arrangements for migrant workers might undermine resilience in some ways. So that's the kind of discussion we want to get going.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. And we now give the floor to Jacopo Mazza, who is a labor economist at the European Commission Joint Research Center in ISPRA. And he will talk about, he will present a paper joint with Francesco Fasani on being on the front line, immigrant workers in Europe and the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's particularly fitting, of course, with the topic of this conference. And Jacopo, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Now I'll start sharing my screen, if it works. Does it work? Do you see my slide deck?
Sure.
So, yeah, okay, good. Okay, so thanks for the invitation, Tommaso, and thanks for the presentation. So you saved me some time. So as you said, this is a joint work with Francesco Fasani at Queen Mary University. And in essence, what our aim is with this work is trying to assess what are the employment consequences of the pandemic on the employment of migrants in the European Union, actually in the EU15. Former EU15, in fact, because we should say maybe EU14 plus the UK. Of course, it's obvious that the human costs in terms of life of this pandemic have been huge. I think the last number that I saw about casualties, there might be issues with casualties, but the most agreed upon numbers are around 2 million casualties, and this was at the beginning of the week, so probably we are exceeding. Of course, we are exceeding that. So these are huge costs, but of course the economic costs, we all know are poised to be gigantic as well. We don't really have a full sense at this time of what this cost will be, also because this cost might be protracting in the next years, but we know that they're big. So there are some estimates. I think yesterday the European Commission, so my employer, released the estimate for 2020, where they claim, or they estimate that the contraction would be in Europe would be 6.2% of national GDP, of the overall GDP. And of course, this huge effect that it has on the economy will translate, is going to translate on the labor market. And this is an obvious link, and a lot of research has been produced in the last 6 months since the onset of the pandemic on trying to assess who is going to be affected mostly by this pandemic. The pandemic might affect you because mandated business closure, or simply because people are not feeling comfortable in leaving their house, so they're not feeling comfortable in engaging in economic activities. And this will reflect on the employment levels. And there are time and time again, researchers have found that who's going to suffer mostly about this, the consequences of this slump. Well, it's going to be the most vulnerable people. So those that were vulnerable even before the crisis, they're going to be hit even harder now that the crisis, with this crisis. So there are lots of evidence coming out from different countries that women are going to be affected very badly, that low earners are going to be affected particularly, and that minorities in the US have been affected in particularly hard way, and also related somehow, but not completely on the same tone, but also there are going to be effects on students of low socioeconomic background. They will be particularly affected by school closures. So what about migrants? What do we know about the employment effects for migrants? Well, we have some evidence coming from the US that tell us that migrants have been affected badly by the slump, at least by the first wave and the first wave of lockdown. So this is evidence coming from Borges and Cassidy. They were looking at data, at CPS data from the last spring. So we don't know yet. I don't know whether they have updated the research with new waves of the last autumn. But anyway, in last spring, they saw very bad effects. So what about Europe? Well, it's harder to tell for Europe, and mostly because of we don't have the same data available that the American research have. We don't have the CPS, we don't have the current population survey, we don't have this high frequency monthly data on the labor market in an harmonized way. What we have in Europe are aggregate data so far, produced by Eurostat, and those are data that take the averages of big groups at national level, so of migrants or natives, but they're not micro data. Or what we have are national LFS that are starting maybe now to release the data for the last 2 quarters of 2020, where we can start seeing. But we don't have harmonized data. But well, we can form some expectations on the employment effects of this pandemic on migrant workers, and those are not good. Well, mainly because we know that migrants are employed with non-standard working arrangements more frequently than natives. We also know that the job tenure tends to be shorter than that of natives, the newcomer in the labor market. So there is a higher incidence of short job tenure. And we also know that they tend to be the migrants tend to be overrepresented in low skills occupations. And these are all elements that bode quite badly for their employment status. And plus, we should not forget one thing, which I'd like to stress, is that migrants, they display an additional dimension of vulnerability, which is the fact that not only losing a job for them, it doesn't only imply that they're losing their monthly livelihood, which is a dramatic experience per se, but as it is in many countries, their legal status is tied to their job tenure. Then it might be the case that losing the job for them means also having to leave their country of election. So it's a huge disruption of their life, not only their livelihood. So there are additional level of vulnerability for migrants. So what is it that we do? We tend to do in this research? Well, we try to sidestep the absence of data covering the continent by tying the migrants' employment in the former EU15, and we tie their employment to the job characteristics, so which job they are actually performing. We do that because in this way we don't need high-frequency data, because these job characteristics, they change much slower in time, so that we can rely on older waves of European LFS, which is what we do. We rely on the European LFS of 2019. And look at job characteristics and how these job characteristics of migrants actually are interacting with the particular characteristics of this economic crisis. So we construct an employment risk measure based on this job characteristic, on these 4 job characteristics that I will present and discuss just in the next slide. And in this way, we're able to sort of bridge and fill the gap of microdata, and we are able to identify who and how many migrants and where these migrants are at risk of unemployment, high risk of unemployment in Europe. In this way, as I said, we overcome the lack of harmonized microdata. And additionally, we think this is an important feature of this indicator that we are suggesting and we are arguing for, is that it can be used for forecasts. So it can be used by policymakers for forecasting how possible, we hope that's not going to happen, but possible future lockdown are going to impact the labor market prospects of migrants, but not only migrants, in fact. We concentrate our talk here in migrants, but of course, this number can be produced in the same way also for natives. And we argue that our measure has a good predicting ability. I'll show you later what we mean. So how do we measure employment risk? Well, we identify 4 dimensions that we think are relevant for identifying employment risk. The first one is whether one person is occupied in an essential or non-essential occupation. So we know that essential occupations, those are key occupations that were quickly identified by governments throughout the world. Those were tasks that had to be performed no matter what to keep societies working, to keep society functioning, at least at the basic level. And so the issue now is that, of course, these essential workers, they are exposed to a higher risk of contagion just because they had to leave their home. They couldn't sit behind their computer. Some could, most of them couldn't. So they increase their health risk, but the converse of that is that their occupation was probably safeguarded. So we look at the prevalence of essential key workers in Europe, and what we see here is that 42% of extra EU workers, so migrants from outside of the EU, are essential, given our definition, which takes the communication of the European Commission that has identified in last spring who were the essential workers and not. 38% of EU mobile are essential. So these are EU citizens that live in a country different from their country of birth. And while natives, the prevalence of essential among natives is the lowest, is 7 percentage points lower than the extra EU. And so in this respect, we can say that if essential occupation sort of safeguards your occupation, we can say that migrant workers, according to this characteristic, are safeguarded compared to natives. It's also important to note that if we look at composition in terms of skills of this essential occupation, migrants tend to be overrepresented in low-skilled essential occupation. Then the second dimension that we look at is the type of contract that that the worker is employed with. So migrants tend to be more likely to be employed with the temporary contracts than natives. This is obviously a dimension that is always valid, whichever type of economic crisis we're talking about. And the third dimension is very specific to this crisis, to this recession, which in this economic climate in which we're trying to minimize social interaction. And this is the ability for a worker to telework, so to work from home. What we see is that out of the 4 out of the 5 most frequent migrants' occupation are below average for teleworkability. So the occupation of migrants, they tend to be occupied in occupations that are hardly teleworkable. And the fourth and last dimension that we look at is how resilient the industry in which the migrant are occupied, or any worker is occupied. We define resilience based on work of Pagano and co-authors, where they basically define resilience according to the level of personal interaction that a job entails. So the personal interaction with customer, the personal interaction that you have to have with colleagues on your job place. And what they show, Pagano and co-author, is that in fact the industry that they define as resilient are also those industries that have suffered the least in the stock market. So armed with these 4 characteristics, we are able to define who are the workers that are at very high risk. And we define a worker at very high risk if she is employed in non-essential occupation with a temporary contract, in a non-teleworkable occupation, in a non-resilient industry. And then we also define high risk workers for all those workers for which one of these 4, they're also non-essential, but one of the other 3 at least is not met. So they might be employed in a non-teleworkable occupation, in a non-resilient industry, but at least they're occupied they're employed with a permanent contract. So armed with this taxonomy that let's say we can we can see what is the prevalence of workers at high risk. And it's what we do in this graph here. We have all our 15 countries on the vertical axis. For each country, we define the 3 origin groups. So the first bar is for native, the second bar is for EU mobile, and the third bar is for extra EU workers. And you see here the pink part of the bar shows you the workers at very high risk and at high risk of unemployment. And you see that there is, well, first of all, the third bar tends to be higher in each country. So that means that the extra EU migrants are almost everywhere in every country more at risk. And this is despite the fact, remember, that there is a higher prevalence of extra EU workers among the key workers. Then the EU mobile have similar risk than natives. And it's also important to note that there is a very high variability between countries. This is irrespective of the origin. But if we look at the prevalence of high-risk workers in Portugal, Italy, or Germany, that's almost twice as much. That's around 40%, and that's almost twice as much as the same prevalence for Luxembourg, the UK, or Belgium, which is around 20%. So how good is our measure? I said we think we can use this measure for forecasting. We would like to sort of have some validation that we are actually talking about something that has some sense. So what we do to validate this measure, we take, as I said earlier, the Eurostat has produced some aggregate level data on employment fall for each origin group in each country, at least. I think the last numbers that I saw were numbers for the second quarter of 2020. I think that by now they might have released for sure the third quarter, maybe also the fourth quarter of 2020. And then we compare the share of workers at high risk with the employment rate change that has been observed. But before doing that, I would like to show you how our measure of workers at high risk here, which is on the horizontal axis, compared to employment rate changes that have been observed between 2018 and 2019, so the year before the pandemic. And as you see, basically, there is no relationship between the two, between our measure of risk of employment and the employment change. But if we look at now this measure between the second quarter of 2019 and the second quarter of 2020, so 3 months into the pandemic, we see that this relationship becomes clear and negative. So when workers, positive in the sense, negative in the sense that the employment rate change is negative. But so as the employment, the workers at high risk increase, the share of workers at high risk increased, then the observed drop in employment between 2019 and 2020 has actually gone down more. And this relationship, the R square of this relationship, this simple relationship is around 0.5. So it's fairly high for this in the univariate regression. So we think that this is a good measure that we can use, and we can use for forecasting as well. So how much more at risk, in fact, are with this measure, how much more at risk are migrants compared to natives, and also females? Well, to do that, we perform simple regressions in which we have on the left-hand side, we regress the probability of being at high risk on some personal characteristics here, the origin and your gender. In the first two columns here, we don't interact gender dimension with origin, while in the last two columns we do. So that gives us the ability to distinguish between the effect of being a woman and a migrant, or a man and a migrant, while in the first two columns we're not able to do that. So what we see here is that in the first column, where we do not control, we do not account for where the workers are employed, we see that quite strikingly, there is no difference between natives and migrants. These coefficients here are basically zero. No? This is the difference in probability of being a high-risk worker between natives and EU mobile, or between natives and extra EU worker. While we see that surprisingly female are less at risk compared to natives, compared to men being in a high-risk profession. Well, but once we start looking within occupation and industry, we see that this effect basically reverts. Women now within occupation, they are more at risk, and extra EU migrants are also more at risk, 1 percentage point more at risk than a native to be at high risk. This is the change that I was talking to you about, and is the change for female. Now, when we interact, we see that there is an interesting feature. We think that the higher risk for extra EU workers of being in a high risk group is actually driven by men. So migrant women, they actually have a lower probability than migrant men to be at high risk. So this higher probability of migrant is mostly driven by men. While for natives, it's the exact opposite. All the only group, the group that is suffering among natives here, is 1 percentage point higher chance of being high risk, are actually females, women. So, in conclusion, what come out from our research is that migrant workers are more frequently employed in key occupation than natives, which should protect them. But despite that, migrant non-key workers are frequently employed with temporary contracts and can telework, and that puts them more at a higher risk. Migrants and women work in safer occupation. That's why we saw that coefficient in the third column that I showed you earlier. But within the occupation and industry, they are more at risk. Also, an interesting side conclusion is that the result that we have in the paper is that native women are losing jobs at a higher rate than equally exposed men. And overall, and that's important since we have that share, that then we can translate those share in numbers. And well, if we translate those share of workers at high risk in numbers of people, well, we see that more than 9 million migrants in our pool of countries are at higher risk of unemployment. And this is a huge effect. So this is that's all for me. I think I've exhausted my time, and I will stop here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jacopo. That's a very interesting overview of the riskiness of migrant jobs across the EU. So I have a question myself, but before that, I'd like to invite the audience to ask questions if they have any. I don't want to abuse my position as a chair, but since there are no questions so far, so again, you can type your questions in the Q&A window. So I was actually surprised, Jacopo, by your result on gender, and basically the fact that immigrant women seem to be less at risk of losing their job than men. And so I find this surprising, especially in the light of the results that we present later, where I actually show that in Italy, at least, it's been exactly the other way around. So it's immigrant women in Italy who have lost their jobs because of the COVID crisis, whereas immigrant men have, at least in the very first phase for which we have data for, seem to have somehow coped better with a COVID shock. So the employment rate differential between men and women has not really, between immigrant men and native men has not increased. So this is somehow surprising in the light of these results. They wonder whether there is some other dimension, perhaps about I don't know, female employment that can explain that.
Yes. So thanks for your for the question. So first of all, if we go back to the numbers here that I'm showing you, I think it's quite instructive to look at column 3 and column 4 here, where we control and don't control for occupation, and we see the big jump here happens when we control for occupation. So if we look at column 3, we're not looking at within occupation industry, we're just looking overall. And we see already that migrant women here have lower probability of being employed of being at high risk, much lower than men, in fact. So there is a sorting effect. I think that migrant women overall tend to be sorted in occupations that are less at risk. And that is also due, in my opinion, to the fact that they are overrepresented on the key worker dimension. So in a lot of occupations that are key working, then migrant women tend to be overrepresented in those occupations. So that sort of protects them from possible shocks. Then once we look within industry, and occupation, what is left there? It's mostly the effect of the employment, the type of contracts that one has. So this variability here is generated mostly, in my opinion, by the fact that migrant men in the specific occupation where they're in, migrant men tend to be occupied with temporary contracts at higher rates than migrant women. That could be to a sense. It's also probably an effect of higher selection among women in the labor market, migrant women in the labor market than men. So there is a higher pool of men that participate in the labor market than migrant women. And that could create the effect that they have more, they're employed even with temporary contract, more frequently than women. Okay, so thanks a lot. Thanks for your presentation, and we can now move to the next speaker, who is Ashish Shenoy, who is an assistant professor of agricultural resource economics and UC Davis. And we are particularly grateful to Ashish because he managed to be with us, even though he's currently in California. So it's very early in the morning. So we appreciate a lot the fact that we apologize actually for waking you up so early. And thanks for being here. So Ashish is presenting a paper on migration, labor market impacts of COVID-19 with a lot of co-authors. And the floor is yours. So you would speak for up to 20 minutes, and we don't take questions during your talk, but the audience can ask questions on this Q&A function of Zoom, and then we'll then report their questions to you after you've finished your presentation. Thank you.
Great. So thanks so much for inviting me to talk here, and I appreciate the opportunity. Unfortunately, the time difference is something I've had to get used to living in California over this Zoom period. But so I'm excited to share today results from two studies that we've been doing that look at the effects of COVID-19 on migrant labor among three populations, two populations in Bangladesh and one in Nepal. And so the study is motivated, or both of these studies are motivated by this fact that I think everyone in the world is familiar with right now, that that during the COVID-19 period, mobility has been restricted both legally for public health reasons, and even if there weren't legal restrictions, you'd probably see a decline in mobility due to people themselves trying to protect their own health. And so we wanted to look at what the effect of this was. And just to sort of give an overview of the results that we found, we found that first of all, migrant-dependent households, that is, households that send migrants, seem to be especially vulnerable to economically during this COVID-19 period. Compared to migrants that don't send households in the same regions, it seems that migrant sending households face 25% greater declines in earnings. And in the populations we're looking at in South Asia, this has led to a 20 percentage point increase in the likelihood of being food insecure during the early months of the COVID-19 period. And then in a second paper, we also note that a lot of this migration involves informal trade as well, that people will bring back primarily food products as they're migrating. And we find that in communities where there are high rates of migration, we've seen increases in the prices of both food and fertilizer. This is in Nepal. And this is beyond just being a shock to the households that are sending migrants. This seems to be a community-wide shock that also affects non-importing households who share sort of the same product market with these importing households. And I think the main takeaway from both of these studies is that migration and these informal trade linkages are a way in which we see economic linkages across space that may not necessarily track public health risk. And so we see economic fallout from the COVID-19 disease that doesn't necessarily track the public health risk. And so we may want to, when we think about targeting resources, for targeting resources for economic recovery, shouldn't just follow the sort of public health danger, but we need to think about these linkages when we're thinking about who's economically vulnerable during this period. The main data that we use for both of these studies comes from a set of phone surveys that we conducted from April through June 2020. And so these were short, 20-minute phone surveys to try to get people to actually stay on the line and give responses. And we managed to get about an 80% response rate. And so we think these are sort of random samples from populations that we had been studying or doing work with for other reasons prior to COVID-19. And so we think this is some of the first sort of systematically randomly sampled data coming out of these areas, looking at what's happening or how households are faring during this period. And so there's three samples that I'm going to talk about. One is visa lottery participants in Bangladesh. This is from a visa lottery program that started in 2013 for sort of medium-term migration to work in Malaysia. So this is typically men traveling to work for a period of several years in Malaysia from around the country of Bangladesh. The second is from a seasonal migration program in a high migration rural region of northern Bangladesh. And this is a program that targeted landless agricultural households. And these are primarily seasonal migrants, and they predominantly migrate domestically. So they migrate to other parts of Bangladesh for 2 or 3 months throughout the year. And then we also study a population in a high migration region of rural western Nepal. And this sample here, again, is drawn from the bottom half of the income distribution in this region. And these, again, are predominantly seasonal migrants, although we also see some more medium-term migrants that travel to destinations within Nepal and India. And so we have sort of a mix of both local migration and local short-term migration, as well as more sort of international longer-term migration. So the first study that looks at the effect of COVID-19 among these populations is trying to look at the exposure of migrant-dependent households relative to non-migrant households in these populations. And so we're going to do a basic difference in difference specification, where we will regress economic outcomes on households' past migration exposure or past reliance on migration interacted with time dummies for pre and post COVID. And so the identification for this first study in the visa lottery program comes from actual randomized variation. So this it was a visa lottery, it was oversubscribed, and so these lotteries were given out randomly, or the visas were given out randomly. And so we have randomized variation in which households have access to migration prior to the COVID-19 shock. And then in the other two populations, while we don't have randomized variation, we are able to look at a panel of pre-trend and show that sort of prior to COVID-19, household welfare looked very similar between migrant and non-migrant households. And then we see it diverge in sort of April through June 2020. And just to place this with sort of other studies on the labor market effects of COVID-19, I think there's sort of a number of studies, including the one we just saw, that note that migrant sectors have been the most vulnerable through this economic crisis in OECD countries. And corresponding to that, we've also seen a broad decline in cross-country remittances in sort of the early period of the pandemic. And so we sort of see this as a complement to those studies, in that we study the impacts on households in sending countries. That's sort of the counterpart to the workers at the destination. And in two of our populations, we also study households that rely a lot on short-term single-member migration. And I just want to make a point that this is extremely prevalent throughout the world. So we tried to put together some data from whatever studies we could find that look at the prevalence of migration episodes of less than 12 months of single household members. And in a number of populations, we see that these migration rates are substantially high. It range from sort of 20% up to 70% of households at some point during the year have a member that's away for a period of a few months. And in contrast, in the United States, this is basically zero. I mined US data as hard as I could and couldn't find any subpopulation where we see rates of migration that are greater than 0.5 percentage point. And so this is among subpopulations, but in the countries where we could compare this to national data, we see that these subpopulations make up a large fraction of these countries. So between a quarter to a third of the countries where we had national data have households that send these short-term part-year migrants. And a lot of this is seasonal. So in the places where we could record season, what we see is that more than half of the short-term migration comes during the peak migration season. So I think this tells us a little bit about who to target resources to, as well as when to target them. Sort of migration is particularly important during parts of the year, especially tied to the agricultural cycle. And so what we find in terms of the effects of COVID-19 on migrant-dependent households is that sort of in general, we see that there is COVID-19 is an economic shock to both migrant households and non-migrant households. But when we break up the shock on households that rely on migration and households that don't, we see bigger declines among migrant households. And so this is for both the Bangladesh lottery program and the households in Western Nepal. We see that migrant households were slightly better off before the pandemic, and that difference disappears during the pandemic period. And sort of the majority of the difference in earnings the difference in decline in earnings in these populations comes from a loss of remittances. So migrant households had high levels of remittance income that sort of disappeared during the pandemic period. And in Nepal, we're able to break this down into its component sources. But before I get to that, I just wanted to compare this to official statistics. And so this is data that was published by the World Bank's NOMAD program on the decline in remittances around the world. So I want to highlight our two countries of study are right here, where the decline in earnings that we see, and particularly in remittance earnings, is on the order of like 25% in our surveys. Whereas in official statistics, we see much smaller declines. That we see almost nothing in Nepal, and declines of maybe around 5% in Bangladesh. And so sort of suggests that I think there's a large amount of informal remittances that maybe aren't picked up in the official data. And I think that also cautions looking forward that we've seen this fact in a few places that it seems to be a bounce back in remittance income in Q3 2020 that suggests that I think people have been optimistic that migrant households might be bouncing back because of this, and sort of our data suggests that at least in Q2 we see much larger declines than are reported officially, and so we don't have the data to confirm this, but I think we should be cautious about interpreting these bounces back in Q3 because official statistics might be missing a large portion of migrant remittance income. And so breaking down where these where the decline in remittances come from, we're able to do this in the Nepal data. What we find is both there's less migration during the COVID-19 period. So comparing migration during the COVID-19 period, which hit right before a wheat harvest, to the prior rice harvest, we see that the absolute level of migration is lower during the wheat harvest than during the rice harvest, as well as sort of immediately post-harvest, migrants typically return home for the harvest and then go back to their destinations post-harvest, and we don't see that bounce back in after COVID-19. The migration sort of is lower and then stays low. And then even among those households that do have migrant OA, we see lower remittances per migrant in those households. And so there's this decline in sort of remittances per migrant by about a half to a third after the COVID-19 period. And so this translates into declines in household earnings. And what we find is, so we also ask these households about their food security. And what we find is this decline in earnings also leads to a big increase in food security that's concentrated among migrant households. And so this is data from northern Bangladesh. And the way to read this graph is these two solid and dotted lines represent rates of food insecurity for migrant and non-migrant households in 2018 to 2019. And these dots show the first 4 months of 2020. And so what we find is in the pre-period, the migrant and non-migrant household food insecurity track each other pretty closely. There's a small gap that opens up during the lean season, but otherwise they're pretty similar. And the same pattern holds in the first 2 months of 2020. After the COVID-19, after it spread globally and we started seeing lockdowns, there's a big gap that opens up, that it seems like migrant households are particularly exposed to this COVID-19 shock. This sort of corresponds to the increasing decline in earnings, is that there's an increasing food insecurity among migrant households. And so we see the same pattern in Nepal as well. So this is sort of the year prior to the COVID-19 shock. And then in the year of the COVID-19 shock, we see this gap open up between migrant and non-migrant households after sort of the global spread of the pandemic. Right, and then trying to look into the mechanisms a little bit, what we find is that a lot of this comes from the fact that, or we suspect that a lot of this comes from the fact that return migration poses health risks. And so within our own data, we did a sort of symptom survey to ask people if they had experienced certain symptoms over the previous 2 weeks. And households where there was a return migrant were twice as likely to report COVID-related symptoms. And I think this reinforces administrative data that we've seen from a couple of sources, where it seems that migration is one vector through which the disease was spread. But what that means on the labor market side is that return migrants end up socially isolated. So we see that they have twice as large declines in hours worked and are 3 to 4 times more likely to be excluded from social events within their community relative to non-migrants. And so, from a public health side, that's maybe beneficial, and that's a way to help limit the spread of the disease. But that means that migrants are not sort of able to reintegrate into their local labor markets to make up earnings that they lost from migration. And so those are effects that we see on the migration side. In a second study, so this is very preliminary work that's still ongoing, but I want to share some early results with you. That in a second study, we note that the migration corresponds to informal imports, especially in Nepal. We see there's a larger amount of informal importing of food and fertilizer from India that sort of migrants bring back with them as they travel. And so we found that in this post-COVID period, there's been a decline in this informal importing. We see it sort of remains steady leading up to March 2020, and then falls to almost nothing following the outbreak of the pandemic. And so we want to study the effect of this decline in informal importing on these populations as well. And so here we're going to use a similar difference in differences regression specification, where we'll regress the price of a food product K on the time dummies times the fraction of that food product that was previously sourced from India. And so we'll do this both at the household level, as well as we have a corresponding survey of local shops, and so we can do this at the shop level as well. And so this is sort of I just want to emphasize these are preliminary results, so we're still trying to break down sort of exactly what's going on here. But in general, what we find is an increase in prices among those food products that are imported from India, or that are imported from India before the pandemic. And so we can see this monthly, as well as if we pool the months of COVID together, there's about a 10% increase in prices. Breaking down where this increase in prices comes from, we see that sort of initially in April 2020, we find that there are both higher prices in villages where there's a high fraction of food importers, as well as a price premium for those households that are the ones that are actually importing and consuming imported food. After April 2020, in June and September, this household-specific price premium goes away. It seems like the persistent effect of this thing is a market shock, that the prices remain higher in import-dependent villages. Specific importing households have been able to resource their food, and so we don't see a household-level premium anymore, but we still see the market shock persist. So those are results for food. We've also looked at fertilizers. That's another thing that has a high level of informal imports from India, and is some measure of how COVID-19 is affecting investment in the future. This is the use of fertilizer during the planting period that will correspond to harvests later on down the line. And so here the results are a little bit more complicated because of the market structure in fertilizer. That in Nepal there's sort of this dual market for fertilizer. One is through the cooperative structure that relies on formal government imports, and the other is through the private sector that relies on informal imports from India. And so here we see again an increase in fertilizer prices that are concentrated in this informal import sector. And so we're still working on seeing how this translates into fertilizer use and fertilizer prices among households. But one thing that we found is that these formal imports have they're sort of quantity restricted, and so it seems like during the pandemic period, households that belong or have membership within a cooperative are the ones who have access to these formal imports at a lower price, and households that don't have membership in a cooperative face these higher prices among these price increases that come from informal imports. And so to summarize sort of what we see is the main policy implications that come out of this pair of studies. I think first is that we find that migrant households are especially vulnerable during the COVID-19 period, in that they both face the dual threat of a greater health risk and greater economic risk during this period. And so when we think about targeting resources, we ought to focus on migrant households. And these are in many parts of the world, these are sort of, they're identifiable populations and identifiable times of the year that will be particularly vulnerable. And these populations make up a substantial fraction of the national population. Second, we find that migration is linked to informal trade. And so we see that the sort of beyond households themselves that send migrants to foreign destinations, trade-dependent communities may also be exposed to economically exposed in that we see local prices increase. And we see some evidence that formal government imports can substitute for these informal imports and play a role in price stabilization. And so that's potentially a policy instrument that's worth exploring. And so I think for both of these effects, we find that the loss of livelihood has public health consequences. First, there's just the direct consequence of food insecurity. that we want to mitigate directly. And second, there's sort of a sort of an indirect channel in that loss of livelihood may be a complement to sort of public health risk, in that it may be harder for households to comply with lockdown policies or other sort of social distancing guidelines if they're worried about sort of basic food security. And so we may even think of sort of economic stabilization as a public health policy to facilitate compliance with social distancing guidelines and other sort of mobility restrictions. And I think the big takeaway that we have from all of this is that economic distress may not coincide with health risk. That migration and trade linkages are a way in which economic shocks can be transmitted across space. Typically, we think of these things as smoothing out risks. And so like sort of providing a bigger population over which local shocks are experienced is a way of sort of sharing risk across space. But in this case, sort of with both the global nature of the pandemic and its sort of the specific policy tool of limiting mobility to combat the pandemic, what we see is this actually heightens the risk of migrant communities. And so when we think about targeting resources for economic stabilization or recovery, we sort of need to separate that from targeting resources for public health recovery and think about households that are affected through these migration and trade shocks. So those are sort of the main takeaways that we have from this set of work. And so I'm happy to take any questions. And here's my contact information.
Okay, thank you very much. So that was a very interesting look at a low-income country after talking about Europe. We have one question from the audience, actually two questions. So the first question is, refers to food security, and I would have expected migrant households to be more food secure in normal times, because migration allows the household to engage in risk diversification and reduce their exposure to local crop failures. But your graph seems to indicate that there is no difference between migrant and non-migrant households before the COVID period. So, the question is, that's actually the case, or whether he just misread the graph. Second question is whether we should think of the dual threat for migrants, health and economic risk, as similar to that faced by seasonal workers in advanced economies.
Yeah, great question. So on the food security side, let me say first, I think these are sort of both of those food security graphs were among populations that were selected to be sort of similar. I guess it's a narrow slice of the population. So the Bangladesh one was among landless agricultural workers, and the Nepal one was among rural households from the bottom half of the income distribution. So I think that both is a reason that they're sort of ex ante similar. And then second, among those populations, migration is an endogenous decision, and so it's not. I don't know that the I guess like the sort of different households have different smoothing mechanisms. And so the households that were dependent on migration are the ones that use migration as their smoothing mechanism. But the households that aren't dependent on migration, it's not necessarily because they're unable to migrate. It's a choice not to migrate. And so I think that's more of an indication that they have alternate smoothing mechanisms locally that they're able to use. And so that's why I think that's probably why we don't see differences ex ante, is because sort of different households can choose their smoothing mechanism, and so what we're seeing is sort of like the endogenous choice of households and the difference between migrant and non-migrant. And then to the second point about the thinking about seasonal workers in advanced economies, I think that's potentially true. I don't have that much experience with seasonal workers in advanced economies, and so I don't want to speculate too much. But it does seem to be it seems to capture a lot of similar phenomena that sort of I think in advanced economies we've definitely seen that travel is sort of one vector through which COVID spreads, and so seasonal workers may also be additionally exposed there. And in advanced economies, we've seen the sort of seasonal sectors. I think especially things like hospitality have been especially hard hit, and so we potentially also see larger declines in sort of seasonal sectors in advanced economies. But that's I don't have the data to back that up. I just think that sort of it seems likely that there are similarities between that seasonal type of migrant work in advanced economies as compared to the populations that we've been able to study.
All right, so thanks a lot. So this is the end of this first session. So now we take a short break and we reconvene in 10 minutes. So we restart at 4:05 Italian time. And thanks a lot for your attention so far, and see you soon.
Good. Good afternoon, everyone. We are here to start again with the second session of this conference on immigration and COVID-19, organized by the Centro Studi Luca in cooperation with FIERI and with Collegio Carlo Alberto, of course. The second session will be devoted to some less tangible, but certainly not less important aspects of the impact of COVID on immigration and immigrants. Namely, we will focus on mental health and attitudes with two presentations. The first one with which we will start is by Climent, Quintana-Domeque, hope you pronounce it well, from Exeter University, who presents a paper jointly written with Eugenio Proto. Climent, the floor is yours.
Buongiorno a tutti e grazie. Thank you so much for the invitation and the presentation. It's an honor to be at least virtually here today. I'm going to be talking about mental health. Let me see if I can share my screen. So this is a joint work with Eugenio Proto at the University of Glasgow. And in this paper, what we're doing is to measure the impact of the COVID pandemic on mental health, and as you will see, this is measuring effects in the very short run. So it's just like 1 month after the beginning of the pandemic, and this is in the UK. And we're going to be focusing on 2 dimensions of this impact. One is going to be by ethnicity, and the other one is going to be by gender. So just briefly telling you what's the main thing that we're going to be doing. We will be using longitudinal data. So this means that we're going to be able to follow individuals over time. So we're going to have observations for the same individual before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And this is data from Understanding Society, which is following individuals over time in the UK. And in particular, during the COVID pandemic, they started with the so-called COVID study, which has been running since April 2020 and is still running. And essentially, we're going to be using information on mental health, demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. And in particular, we're going to be using mental health in terms of like what is called the 12-item general health questionnaire. This is a way to measure mental health. And just to give you an insight, this is a battery of questions, 12 items, which asks individuals about things like how their feelings over the last few weeks. So, for instance, the first item is about whether how have you recently been able to concentrate on whatever you were doing, and then they can answer better than usual, same as usual, less than usual, much less than usual, and several other questions. The last item is about have you recently been feeling reasonably happy, all things considered, and again, this is measured in a Likert scale, more so than usual, about the same as usual, and less so than usual, and much less than usual. So this is the way we're going to be measuring mental health, which is quite common in the literature. And as I said, we're going to be comparing pre-COVID pandemic data with during COVID pandemic data, and we're going to be focusing on the dimensions of ethnicity and gender. Okay. So let me just wrap up in terms of like what are the main findings. So we are going to find that mental health deteriorates. So there is a drop in mental health, in average mental health, as measured by the average JHQ-12. And then we're going to see some sort of variation, in particular, or heterogeneity. In particular, we're going to see that the largest increases in mental distress are for women, and this is regardless of their ethnicity. And we're going to see also that there is a larger increases also among men from ethnic minorities, and these are men from Black, Asian, and other ethnic minorities in the UK. And these two findings together generate the situation in which the gender gap in mental health increases only among white British individuals. Okay, so we are going to observe that the gender gap in mental health among the white British population increases. And trying to understand what's going on within like the ethnic minority groups, we're going to see that the effects for men are in particular very strong among men from Bangladeshi, Indian, and Pakistani ethnicities. Okay, so these are the main findings of this study. Now, to tell you a bit of the background about the situation of the COVID pandemic in the UK back in March and April 2020, this was, of course, a massive negative health and economic shock. In particular, 25% of the deaths reported in March and April were somehow related with coronavirus, involved the coronavirus. And if we compare like the economic activity between the first quarter and the second quarter of 2020, these dropped by about 16 points. So this was a huge, massive shock. And there is lots of evidence right now, and it has been accumulating over the last year, that the impact of the pandemic in terms of like mortality risk and also economic impact differs by ethnicity. So in particular, there is evidence showing that the minority ethnic groups have been more affected by the pandemic in comparison to the white population. And also that in terms of like mortality, but also in terms of like the impact, the economic impact. So that's something that is there. And just like to extend a bit on this point. So in terms of mortality, we know that they have a higher risk of acquiring infection, and this is also related with the type of jobs that the ethnic minority groups are working on. So, for instance, taking the example of the Indian ethnic population in England and Wales, so they represent 40% of doctors. But of course, if you look at how much do they represent in terms of the working age population, they represent only 3%. So the sort of type of jobs that they have, they're types of jobs which are kind of like high risk. And also there is evidence out there just like documenting the average risk. And it shows as well that ethnic minority individuals have a higher risk in comparison to white British individuals, not just for the working age population, but also focusing on the population 65 and above. But not only that, we also know that independently of exposure, once infected, they also are more likely to develop poor outcomes. And the problem is, like, for instance, if we look at the data, we know that in particular, looking at the Bangladeshi population, they are more likely, in particular, more than 60% likely to have a long-term health condition compared to white British age 60 or above. So this in terms of mortality. In terms of economic impact, the same thing goes. So we see, like, for instance, that the Pakistani men are 70% more likely to be self-employed than white British, the white British majority. And also in terms of the type of jobs, in terms of affected by the pandemic, we know that they are more likely to be working in the restaurant sector or in the taxi driving, so which are, of course, sectors that have been affected more seriously by the pandemic. Now, in terms of gender, what do we know about the pandemic? Well, there has been lots of studies on this, and I'm just citing some of them focused on the UK. And what we have seen, and what we confirm in this study, is that focusing on mental health, is that there is a much larger drop in mental health among women than among men. But what is very interesting to try to understand is whether there is an interaction between both ethnicity and gender. And this is one of the things that we do in this study. In particular, we can think that the different roles played by the different quote-unquote gender roles in different households depending on ethnicities. So to take an example, if we compare the Bangladeshi population, 29% of Bangladeshi working age men both work in shutdown sectors, as I was saying before, but also they have a partner who is not in paid work. And this compares with just 1% among the white British men. So this is just like, these are very different type of characteristics, both in terms of like characteristics of the partner, but also characteristics of the job market in terms of like household production, but also market production. So essentially, given this background, given the differences in mortality risk, given the differences in financial security, we expect also that mental health is affected too. And indeed, in recent work with Sonia Refice, we have seen that part of the gender gap in mental health between men and women can be explained by differential COVID-19 related health concerns. So this is something that is important to keep in mind. Okay, so just let me jump into the data that we're going to be using here. And I don't want to spend much time on that, but it's just to give you an overview. So again, we're using understanding society data, and we're using two waves. So we're using the wave of wave number 9 from 2017-2019, and then we're gonna observe the same individual in April 2020. So that's the first monthly COVID-19 wave. And what we can see in this slide is essentially that we are decomposing the number of observations, which is about 50,000 observations, in observations in which we observe the individual twice, which are going to be these observations here, 14,000, and observations that are only observed once. So for instance, they are observed at baseline, but not at follow-up, or they appear in the follow-up, but not they were not there in baseline. In terms of attrition, there is no surprise here. So all studies using the COVID study from Understanding Society report higher attrition rates. The important question is whether attrition is selective. And what we find is that somehow selective attrition, basically driven by mental health at baseline, doesn't seem to be very relevant. So with mental health at baseline, we can only explain 2.8% of the attrition rate. So we are not very concerned by just like not following individuals at follow-up based on their mental health at baseline. So, and let me jump into the distribution of our individuals in our sample by ethnicity and gender. So I'm using the terminology here, BAME, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups, but this is just like something like to just like an abbreviation for a variable. But of course, think about this as minority ethnic individuals other than white British, and BIP. It's the acronym for Bangladeshi, Indian, and Pakistani, and non-BIP is non-Bangladeshi, non-Indian, non-Pakistani. So this is just like the other ethnic minority individuals who are non-Bangladeshi, Indian, and Pakistani. So what we can see here is like 91.5% of our sample are white British, 8.5% are from ethnic minorities, and if we decompose this 8.5%, 2% of them are Bangladeshi, Indian, and Pakistani, and 6.5% are from non-Bangladeshi, non-Indian, non-Pakistani origins. Okay. In terms of gender, 55% of them are women, 45% of them are men, and then basically we have like the gender and ethnic composition here. Okay. And this is probably kind of like the main summary of what we find in a figure. So this figure here has two columns for different groups. So we have BAME women. So these are women from minority ethnic ethnic minorities. We have white British women from the white British majority. BAME men from the ethnic minorities, and white British men. Okay. So if we compare like these two columns, the blue column is basically plotting the average mental health in 2017-2019, and the red column is plotting the average mental health in April 2020. So the first thing that we observe is like average mental distress increases. So this means like there is a deterioration in mental health, no matter whether you are in this group, in this group, in this group, or in this group. That's the first thing to note. Now, the second thing to note, and I think that the next figure is going to show this more clearly, is that this change in mental health from baseline to follow-up, okay, is not the same across different groups. So it's true that mental health decreases, but if we look about the actual change, the change seems to be much stronger among women from ethnic minorities, among men from ethnic minorities, and among women from the white British majority. So for women, ethnicity is not playing a role in explaining this change in mental health, while for men, there is a differential role. So if anything, white British men are the ones less affected by the pandemic. Okay, so this is essentially what we can see in this figure. So that's summarizing the main results. Now, of course, you could think that there are certain characteristics that should be accounted for, and in particular, they could be like things like differences in age, or differences in household size, or the in educational attainment or employment status, many different things. And indeed, if we compare like the age of ethnic minority individuals with the majority ones by gender, what we can see is like in our sample, individuals from ethnic minorities tend to be younger, both men and women, like about 7 years younger men and 6 years younger women. They are more likely to live in larger households. So the household size is larger among ethnic minority individuals, both for men and for women. They are more likely to live in the London area. And they are also more likely to have higher qualifications, in particular to have a university degree. So these are things that we need to take into account. And the way that we are going to take these different factors into account is just by running a regression analysis. So essentially, we are going to run an OLS regression in which delta yi is the change in the JHQ-12 indicator, mental health, in April 2020 versus the mental health in 2017-2019. And then we're going to have a female indicator, 1 for women, 0 for men, a minority ethnic indicator, 1 if the individual comes from an ethnic minority, 0 otherwise, and the interaction between both the gender indicator and the ethnicity indicator to measure this sort of differential effects by ethnicity across gender or by gender across ethnicity. Okay, so this is what we are trying to do. And then the question is, which control variables are we including here? So again, as I was saying, we're going to control for age differences by month of interview indicators, because at baseline, interviews could take place in any month of the year, while these interviews in the follow-up are in April. Of course, interviews were taking like online in follow-up, but at baseline, they could be face-to-face or by phone. So we want to take also this into consideration. We're going to control for household size, for whether the individual is living alone or not, place of residence, qualification, employment status, personal income, and an indicator of having at least one health condition in April 2020. Okay, and then basically that's basically what the regression that we're going to be running. So essentially, the interpretation of this coefficient here is what is essentially the adjusted differential in the change in mental health between who? Between British white women and British white men. If we focus on the BAME indicator, that's going to be the adjusted differential change in mental distress between whom? Between minority ethnic men and British white men. And finally, if we take this interaction gamma plus delta together, we can see whether the change in mental distress between minority ethnic individuals and the white majority, it differs for women, okay, or not. And essentially, what we're going to be doing here is, I'm just reporting the results of this regression, but let me tell you that we are doing this in different ways. So the first 2 columns look at the comparison of the JHQ-12, so the indicator of mental health that we were plotting in the graphs. Of course, the scale of this is between -36 to 36 because the indicator goes from 0 to 36, and we're looking at the changes between baseline and follow-up. So maybe one to think, what about the standardizing that? So that's what we do in columns 3 and 4. We standardize the variables. So this is measuring standard deviation. So and the last column is an indicator of mental health problems, which is basically based on a binary indicator being 1 if the individual reports 3 symptoms or more and 0 otherwise. So the bottom line is, no matter whether you use this type of indicator or this type of indicator, the interpretation is quite the same. We observe that there is an increase in mental distress among women, among ethnic minority men. So that's basically the bottom line of this table. And the other important thing is that it doesn't matter whether we add control variables or not. So not adding control variables, we get that the coefficient is like about one controlling for adding the control variables, and the same thing holds across columns. So this is in a standard deviation. So this is 0.17 against 0.17, and this is 0.09 against 0.1. And the same thing with ethnicity. So 0.8, 0.9, 0.14 standard deviations, 0.15. So it doesn't matter whether you account or not for these sociodemographic characteristics. Okay. So it seems like accounting for these sociodemographic characteristics doesn't explain like the differential increases in mental health among women and among men from ethnic minorities. Now, one of the issues here is that we are not disentangling among the different ethnicities, right? And this is one of the problems, limitations of our study. We don't have many observations in this data set. And in particular, if you just look at ethnic minority individuals, we have about 1,000 observations. These are weighted observations, so weighted by the sampling weights. And if we try to decompose these in terms of like different ethnic minority groups, one of the largest groups is like the Bangladeshi, Indian, and Pakistani, and we have about 2% of these 8.5%. So if we decompose this is about 250 observations. So it's not like we can do a lot in terms of like disentangling differences within different ethnic groups. So that's something to keep in mind. But we try to see what's going on. Let's try to unpack the difference here. And what we are going to observe, so this is the type of before and after changes in mental health by women from Bangladeshi, Indian, and Pakistani ethnicity, from women from other ethnic groups, and white British women. And then the same for men. If we just look at the changes, directly we jump into the changes, what we see is that if anything, as I was telling you before, the group that stands out is the group of Bangladeshi, Indian, and Pakistani men. So these are the ones, this is the group of men experiencing the higher increase in mental distress, okay? And then, again, here we're just plotting the difference in average characteristics by these different groups, Bangladeshi, Indian, and Pakistani, and the other ones in terms of age, household size, and of course, we observe differences in terms of age, household size, so we need to control for them. And again, the same sort of exercise here. So we compare what happens with the unadjusted differences with the adjusted differences, and we don't see much of a difference. So this is there. Now the question is why. So it seems like we cannot explain these differences, these changes in mental health and differences between ethnic groups by our demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. So what is behind this? So one of the main things, I mean, if it's not health concerns, if it's not financial insecurity, and this has attracted quite attention, is the impact of the strict physical distancing measures, right? There is some evidence out there showing that, of course, the fact that there is a lockdown, and remember, this was like at the time of the survey, we were in lockdown in the UK, the lockdown starting in March 23rd. This can have an impact in terms of social isolation and how people cope with stress. And indeed, there is some evidence out there pointing that the level of interaction with neighborhoods has been affected by the lockdown, and it has been particularly affected among minority ethnic groups. Indeed, Nandi and Platt find some evidence showing that the largest reduction in self-reported levels of interpersonal contact within the neighborhood is for Pakistanis and Bangladeshis. So this can be part of the mechanism by which we observe these changes in mental health. Now, let me tell you a bit of the strengths and limitations, and then I'm going to conclude. So the strengths of this study are that we don't have compositional bias and we don't have recall bias. But of course, the main problems are that we have small samples and these generate imprecise estimates, and sort of like we cannot deal with all the heterogeneity across groups. And we are just measuring immediate effects. We're not looking at persistent effects. So these are things that we want to explore. And one of the implications that we would like to emphasize is that we think that there is a huge need to collect larger samples of individuals from minority ethnic populations. Otherwise, it's impossible to perform this type of analysis. The paper is available online. It's published like in PLOS ONE. And if you want to look at the data or replication materials, they are available there. And these are the acknowledgements. And that's basically what I wanted to discuss today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Climent. We have a question about the nationality of a sample. and the origin, or the origin. And indeed, from a continental point of view, where we don't have ethnic statistics, it's indeed very relevant to know this, and to know if you could plot nationality and or country of origin, country of birth in the analysis you have made. Climent.
Yes, this is a very good question, and actually, in principle, it should be possible. So in this analysis, we didn't focus on this part, but there is one question in the understanding society which measures whether the individual is a foreigner or not. So in particular, that's a possibility. Again, one of the main issues is like once we start interacting, like let's say whether the individual was born or not in the UK. Then of course we need to have another cut in the data. But this is a very good point, and that's in principle it's something that can be done. The only limit is the sample size.
Thank you. So we wait for the next edition extended to this if possible.
Thank you.
Good. I think we have to move quickly to the next presentation. Thank you, Climent. The next in line will be Jana Cahlikova. I hope I pronounce it more or less well. Jana is from the Max Planck Institute, and she presents a paper with several co-authors that I'm not trying to pronounce. Jana, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes. And I reiterate the invitation to all our public to put their questions in the Q&A or DNR in Italian section at the bottom of your screen. Thank you. Jana. Jana, are you there?
Yes, I'm just muted, I guess. Yes. Hello, everybody. Can you see my screen?
Yes. No, we can see your face now, but not your screen.
Okay, that's not great. Now you should see my screen,
yes,
hopefully.
Yes, okay.
Perfect. Thank you for having me. And this is joint work with Vojta Bartoš, Michal Bauer, and Julia Chutilova, and I will be talking about COVID-19 and hostility against foreigners. We were specifically interested in hostility towards different outgroups and whether it can rise during such a big crisis. This is a natural concern since we do have some evidence even from the, for example, Middle Ages. So we know that the Black Death from the 14th century resulted in a wave of anti-Jew massacres that spread over Europe, starting in France, but spreading to many other countries. And such a concern has been expressed with the rise of the COVID as well. For example, so there was this main concern that COVID is going to rise hostility against especially Asians in the beginning. But there have also been, for example, reports of increased hostility in China against black persons. So this is a natural concern. I don't have to reiterate how important COVID is of a crisis, but I want to quote Fernand de Warendier, who said, COVID-19 is not just a health issue, it can also be a virus that exacerbates xenophobia, hate, and exclusion. So we know that aggressive behavior against outgroups has a tendency to rise during the periods of health, but also economic crisis. And there are different channels which have been considered in the literature. So the first one is a so-called scapegoating channel. So when there is some shock, for example, economic shock or a health shock, there could be this psychological channel that people need to find someone to blame for the wrong which is happening to them. So tendency to find a scapegoat for what's happening. It could also be that hostility towards outgroups can be a national protection strategy. For example, if certain groups are more likely to carry the virus, more likely to be contagious, it could be natural to try to avoid them. There is also some literature saying that economic shock is not enough, but it's, for example, a combination of economic and political shocks together, which then generate the hostility towards outgroups. So our general question here is we want to identify the causal effect of COVID-19 on hostility towards different types of outgroups. And we want to focus on foreign outgroups, so foreigners, but also on different types of domestic outgroups. So for example, ethnic minorities, people from different regions, people from different political opinions. The main empirical challenges that we had to solve is first, we were interested in hostile behavior specifically. So behavior which is not motivated by selfish interest. And also we wanted to avoid this channel that actually avoiding certain groups could be a rational protective strategy. Second, given that we want to identify causal effect of COVID on different types of outgroups, we also need to have some exogenous variation in the identity of the victim. And we were not interested in whether COVID increases hostility in general. So we also need to compare hostility towards outgroups and hostility towards in-groups, so to have this in-group reference. And again, given that we are interested in a causal effect, we need some exogenous variation in COVID-19 shock, because you can create different types of stories why there could be a correlation. So for example, why some regions are more affected by COVID, but are also more likely to be hostile towards foreigners, why certain economic groups are, for example, more interacting with foreigners and therefore less hostile with foreigners and more exposed to COVID. So we needed to find some random variation in COVID-19 exposure. So what we did, we conducted a large-scale internet experiment in the beginning of the COVID-19. So this is still the beginning of the first wave. The setting is the Czech Republic. So it's one specific country, which is also the biggest disadvantage. So I'll just be showing evidence from this one setting. In terms of contributions to the literature, we take advantage of this unfortunate real pandemic which is happening. We do have a representative sample of the population. We came up with a simple incentivized measure to measure of hostility. And we are able to focus on multiple dimensions of identity. So many discrimination studies, for example, in economics, but also in other sciences, focused on discrimination only against one group. So for example, discrimination against ethnic minorities or discrimination against women. We want to specifically look at discrimination against many of these groups simultaneously. And yeah, as I said, we also experimentally manipulate the salience of COVID-related problems. In principle, such an experiment could be easily replicated in other countries as well. So here I provide evidence from one setting, but it would definitely be very interesting to compare results from different ones. So let me walk you through the details of the design. We have approximately 2,200 participants. So these are representative of the Czech population 18 plus. And what is important here is also the timeline. So the experiment took place at the end of March, beginning of April. So this is the situation when the population was under lockdown. I have some more dates here to provide illustration of what was happening. So the state of emergency has been declared. Schools and shops were closed. Movement of people were restricted. Face masks were already obligatory in public, and only 2 people could meet outside. This is where the data collection took place. It was really the beginning of the first wave. What's interesting is if you look at the situation ex post with almost 1 year delay, it's clear that this first wave in the Czech Republic was actually very, very small. So there were very few cases and very few deaths. There was a second and third wave in the fall and in the winter, which were much stronger. So by now, there is basically 1 million people have already been infected, 1/10 of the population officially. But we still argue that even though the first wave was kind of weak in terms of victims, it was still a period of huge uncertainty and the period when everybody was really worried about the virus. So in this sense, even though the first wave was not strong, it was still a good setting to conduct such a study. Now I'll give you the details of the task. So this is an internet experiment. So this is basically part of a survey. So we knew we had to develop a very simple measure of hostile behavior because there is a tendency that people answer very quickly in the surveys. They might not understand, so it really has to be very easy. So here people are asked to allocate rewards to a set of different people. And as a default, they know that each of these persons is going to get 100 Czech crowns, which is roughly €4. But they can allocate anything between 0 and 200. So they can go to 0 or they can double the default amount. So what we argue is that if they allocate anything below the default, they actually have to actively reduce the money to the recipient, so which is an active hostile behavior towards the recipient. While if they actually increase the money above the default, this is a basic pro-social move. So this default is actually very important in the design. The choices were incentivized, so the participants knew that 30 of them would be selected and one of their choices would be implemented. And also what I have to mention is that they had to make an active choice. So it was not that they could just click next. If they wanted to allocate the default, they would have to click on the default and only then they could continue. So each participant allocates money towards different people. If I remember correctly, we had 17 different allocations. We vary the identity of these different recipients within subject. The order is randomized. So for example, we ask them to allocate money towards a person living in the Czech Republic, towards a person living in the EU, towards a person living in the US, in Asia, and in Africa. We had this discussion whether to choose specific countries or not. So at the beginning of the pandemic, it would have been potentially natural to choose Italy or China or Germany. We did not want to do that for two main reasons. So first, we were worried about the experimental demand effect, basically giving up too much information regarding what we are after. And also we had the idea to actually repeat this survey at later stages of the pandemic, and then we would not know what the hotspots would be in later periods. So this is why we chose such broad categories. So apart from these recipients from foreign countries or this general person living in the Czech Republic, which is the baseline for that, we also focus on domestic divisions. So in this case, the recipients will be allocating money, and they would know that the respondents are allocating money. They know that all the recipients live in the Czech Republic, but they are, for example, from the same region as them, or they are from a different region. They share the political orientation, or they are on the other side of the political spectrum. They are of the majority ethnicity, or they come from the Roma minority, which is the strongest ethnic minority in the Czech Republic. And similarly for religion. So we have these different dimensions of identity that we look into. So this is the screenshot of the task. So for example, here you would be allocating money towards somebody living in Asia. This is the default, and you can allocate anything between 0 and 200. So I'll now tell you how we vary the salience of COVID-19 related thoughts and concerns. For this, we use a so-called priming technique, which has been used heavily in psychology, but to a lesser extent also in economics. And we have two conditions, which basically differ in where in the long survey this help or harm task is placed. Okay. So first, I'll talk about the COVID-19 condition. So here, the help or harm task, so allocating money to the different recipients, is only at the end of the survey, and it's after answering a series of very detailed questions on COVID-19. So the survey takes, the median time is 13 minutes. And the questions ask, do you know anybody with COVID-19? Do you have symptoms? How worried are you? Have you been tested? What is your economic situation? How has COVID-19 affected your economic situation? What is your psychological well-being? So what we argue here is that this survey triggers this complex set of thoughts and concerns. And only after this, you come and you allocate money to the different recipients. In the control condition, the help or harm task is at the beginning of the survey, and only after this, all these COVID-related questions follow. So in terms of interpretation, it is important to mention that what we estimate here is the effects of greater intensity of the COVID-19 related thoughts, in a sense that probably everybody was thinking about the COVID to some extent, But hopefully this COVID-19 condition, by answering this long survey, is thinking about the COVID more than the control condition. Okay, so let me show you the results. I will start directly here with the allocations towards foreigners. So this will be already the estimated effects, but let me first show you here, which is the allocations in the control condition. So please concentrate on this column. So you can see that people allocate more money to domestic recipients compared to foreign recipients, which is an evidence of the standard in-group bias. If you look between the different groups of foreigners, you can see that the European Union recipients receive the most money, and actually the US recipients receive the least money. So in terms of the research question, of course, the estimated effect is more important. So what we see is that people in the COVID-19 condition estimate on average 5 Czech crowns less to foreigners compared to those in the control condition. So the effect of the COVID-19 condition on allocations towards foreigners is negative. And you can see that this holds for the different types of foreigners. The effect is actually the strongest for the foreigners from the European Union. In comparison, COVID-19 condition does not affect allocations towards domestic recipients. So this is not increased hostility towards everybody or lowering allocations towards everybody, but this is lowering allocations specifically to foreigners. I'll also show you this slide, which shows that this is actually due to increased prevalence of hostility in the COVID-19 condition. So it means people who are thinking more about COVID are more likely to actively reduce the money from the default to lower amounts. And actually what we see is that this is mostly driven by the extreme hostility, meaning that people are more likely to allocate 0 if they were in the COVID-19 condition. Okay. So we interpret this as this is not decrease of prosociality, this is actually an increase in actively hostile behavior. The next question is whether such an effect is driven by some specific demographic group, for example, men, women, people with less education, people from rural areas. Given that we have quite a large sample, we can actually check the heterogeneity. And what we see is that the effects are actually mostly across the board, they hold for most demographic groups. So here I plotted the estimated coefficients for the foreigners. So this is pooling over all the foreign recipients, and specifically for the EU recipient for whom we saw the strongest effect. And you can see that the effects are negative for different age groups, for both men and women, and also across different levels of education and income. The picture is a little bit more complex if we look into allocations towards domestic in-groups and domestic out-groups. So we do see the standard in-group biases. So when people treat in-groups better than out-groups on average. But you can see that the estimated effects of COVID are negative kind of all over the board. Most of these differences are not significant when we control for multiple hypothesis testing. But we see that definitely it is not the case that the effect on domestic out-groups would be worse than the effect on domestic in-groups. So it does not seem to be that the hostility towards domestic out-groups is increased as comparison to the in-groups. One last thing I want to mention here is that one possible effect of this big crisis is that increases cohesion within in-groups. So basically people will start acting more pro-socially towards their own groups, which is not what we see here. So we do not see positive effects on the in-groups. We see negative effects also on the in-groups. So let me summarize here. Oh, how did I end up there? Here. So in this paper, we provide causal evidence on how concerns related to COVID shape hostility towards different outgroups. We find this negative effect on foreigners, especially foreigners from the European Union. We do not find evidence that the COVID-19 would amplify biases towards domestic outgroups, but we also do not find evidence that it would increase in-group cohesion. So in terms of political implication, of course, so we do not really distinguish here if this hostility is elevated by politicians or by the people's preferences themselves. So we do not try to distinguish that. But we say that placing blame as a political strategy can either elevate these hostilities or can tap into these pre-existing ones. So this is potentially dangerous. And we argue that this is something we'll need to keep into mind. And it's possible that rebuilding the society, global society after COVID will also need some rebuilding of the social ties, not just the rebuilding of the economic ones. That's it from my side. I would be happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Jana. I don't have questions. Yes, I think I have a question now. And the question is from Tijan Ba. How does your priming make COVID-19 more salient? And I would like to add one question by myself before giving you a floor for answer. I think that these data you presented are extremely interesting and extremely worrying for Europe, for European integration. The fact that other Europeans are the most affected by the increase in hostility is indeed surprising and worrying, particularly if compared with the fact, if I understood well, that there is that there isn't an increase in negative attitudes towards domestic in-groups, in particular Roma, knowing that prejudice, hostility against Roma in Europe in general is strong. This is quite a stark contrast. And it makes us think that nationalism is stronger than pure ethnic prejudice within national borders. I wanted to hear more from you on this. But the first question is, as I said, on, I'm sorry, it disappeared, but
on the priming, yeah, I remember.
Yes, on the priming, right.
Yeah, so basically the argument here is that people in the control condition so they are kind of living their lives within the limit of the lockdown. And then they're asked to answer this survey. And this survey just starts with this help or harm task, okay? While people in the COVID-19 condition start the survey, and then they, for 13 minutes, are asked to think about all these COVID issues. So are they sick? Were they economically affected? How they are feeling? Do they have any symptoms? So the argument here is that people in this COVID-19 condition are forced to think about COVID more before answering the survey, the help or harm task. So in this sense, COVID should be more on the top of their mind when they are answering the survey. As I mentioned, probably both groups, the control and the COVID-19, think about COVID to some extent, but hopefully through this process of forcing them to answer all these detailed questions, the COVID-19 condition thinks about COVID more. So this is basically the exogenous variation that we are using here. And then to the next point, yes, I agree. So we actually, I think our expectations kind of a priori was that we would see this increase in hostility towards Asian in particular, while we actually saw the strongest effect is on the hostility towards EU recipients. We tried to analyze this a little bit. So we, for example, analyzed the political speeches regarding China in the time period. And China was actually mostly mentioned in the context of delivering medical supplies and things like that. So it was not that the Czech politicians would use terms like Chinese virus. It was really more picturing China in this relatively positive sense. So this would probably be different in other countries such as the US. And then the European Union recipients, it could just be that they are the most immediate threat. So the country had been closed at that moment. People could not leave or enter the country. So it could have been this image of COVID still being this imported threat in the beginning. So this is why we think there could be this negative effect. Regarding the comparisons with Roma, so what's interesting that in the baseline, in the control group, we actually see very strong discrimination against Roma. So the Roma are the people who are treated divorced among all the potential recipients, while actually in the control group, the European Union recipients are treated relatively favorably. But you are right that this negative effect of the COVID-19 condition we saw on the foreigners, but we do not see this additional effect towards Roma. But it would be very interesting to also compare this across different countries.
Thank you very much, Jana. That was very interesting. And I think we are done with the second session. I thank you both, Climent and Jana again, and the participants who put questions. And I think I can give the floor now to Tommaso for the third part of this conference. That is, am I right, Tommaso? That is the presentation of the results of your annual report.
Yeah.
The floor is back to you.
So, okay, so you're seeing my slides, right? Yeah. Okay, so thanks a lot. Thanks for being here. And so I'm presenting now some of the key results from our 5th annual report on immigrant integration in Europe, which this year I've written in collaboration with Tommaso Sartori. And the report monitors annually the labor market integration of migrants in the EU and in the UK, I should add this year. And every year, so we have a part where we provide an overview of labor market integration across EU countries, and then another part where we focus on one specific topic. And this year we have focused on the consequences of COVID-19 on labor market outcomes of migrants in Italy. And the analysis is based on microdata from the Italian labor force survey that are updated until June 2020, and therefore allow us to study what has been the short-run effect that the COVID-19 crisis has had on immigrants in Italy. The report, as I said, includes, so that's what I will focus my presentation on. If you're interested in the part of Europe, you can have a look at the report. So a few background data about immigration in Italy. Italy, we believe, is an interesting country to study in this context because it's been the first European country where COVID-19 has been identified, and it's been the first EU country where tough lockdown measures have been implemented. And additionally, it's, with respect to migration, is a country where migration has been in recent years very salient in the public debate because Italy is at the forefront of, is one of the main countries of arrival for asylum seekers and undocumented migrants on Italian shores. So it's a country where immigration is very salient. Immigration is very salient, but as this graph shows, in 2019-2020, immigrants were accounting for about 10% of the overall Italian population, which is slightly below the European average. Actually, in EU 15 countries, so including the EU 14 plus the UK, the average is 12.5%. So Italy is below the Western European country share of immigrants in its population. And also, if you look at this graph, the share of immigrants in the overall population has increased between 2010 and 2020 from 8% to about 10%, but there is some indication or a plateau or actually even a slight decline in the first 2 quarters of 2020. So whether this is a statistical artifact or whether this is confirmed, we don't yet know, but at least immigration certainly has not increased recently. More than half of migrants in Italy are from Europe, 1/3 are EU mobile citizens, and 25% are from other European countries outside of the European Union. One distinctive feature of Italy is the low level of education, both of immigrants and of natives. Okay, so this graph reports the distribution of immigrants and natives across different education levels. And as you can see, there's about 11%, actually 13% of immigrants with a high level of education, where high means tertiary education, which compares with 21% of natives. And this, both the native figure and the Italians figure are the lowest in Europe. Okay, so there's only Romania that has a lower share of tertiary educated natives than Italy. Also, there's a very high share of immigrants who have a low level education, where low level education is defined as having at most upper secondary education. So about 50% of immigrants have at most upper secondary education. So the average level of education of immigrants in Italy is pretty low. And also, it is worth noting that this has been deteriorating over time. So in the previous editions of the report, we've documented how the average level of education of immigrants in Italy has decreased in recent years. The labor market, so coming to the labor market distribution, the sectoral distribution of immigrants and natives in Italy is quite different. And as we have heard about Europe in the presentation by Jacopo earlier, even in Italy, there are some sectors where immigrants are particularly concentrated, and the sector that has the highest concentration of immigrants relative to natives is the other services sector, which includes domestic workers and personal care workers. Okay, they're all included in this other service sector. You see the share of immigrants working in other services is 22%. So it's more than 4 times the share of natives working in other services. Also, this is a female-dominated sector, and there's in fact 40% of immigrant women that are concentrated in this sector. And true, this is a female-dominated sector, but that means that there's 7% of Italian women in other services. So even compared to Italian women, the concentration of immigrant women in services is extraordinary. And there's also a relatively high proportion of immigrant men in other services, that's 7%. In contrast, Italian men working in other services are less than 3%. Other sectors with a higher concentration of immigrants and natives are construction sector and hospitality sector, so hotels and restaurants. Notice that basically all these 3 sectors are sectors that have been significantly affected by the pandemic. Okay, the hospitality sector has essentially been shut down to a very large extent, first by the lockdown and then by all the restrictions that have been imposed on travels, on domestic and international travels. So let me skip that for the sake of time. Another issue that I'd like to stress is that immigrant jobs are also much less likely to be teleworkable relative to native jobs. Okay, so this graph here reports the distribution of immigrants, the red scattered line, and natives, the blue solid line, across an index that measures the degree to which a job can be performed remotely. Okay, so higher values of this index indicate that the job can more easily be performed from home, whereas lower value of an index indicate that the job cannot be performed from home, or is more difficult to be performed from home. So what you see here pretty clearly is that natives, Italians, are much more concentrated at the top of this teleworkability distribution, whereas natives are more concentrated at the bottom. So that means in terms of the how this interacts with COVID, that either some of these jobs that cannot be performed remotely will just not exist, like many jobs in hospitality sector, for instance, or on the other hand, those jobs that still are needed during the pandemic but cannot be performed remotely will be performed in presence, and therefore will expose immigrant workers to a higher health hazard relative to native workers, because when being forced to work on the workplace means potential interaction with co-workers and clients, and means interaction with other people on the way to work, on the daily commuting to work. Okay, so immigrant jobs are much less workable than natives jobs. And another characteristics of immigrant jobs that again resembles what we have seen earlier about Europe is that immigrant jobs are key in fighting the pandemic. So the share of workers, of immigrant workers that are employed in an occupation that is essential for the response to the pandemic is higher than among Italians. In fact, the gap between the share of immigrants in essential occupations and share of Italians, of natives in essential occupations, is the highest in Italy than in every other EU country. Okay, so essential occupations here are not only health professionals, of course, or health workers in general, but also other occupations such as transport workers or IT technicians. So these are all professions that are badly needed in designing a response to a health crisis. On the other hand, however, when the Italian government implemented the lockdown in March, some industrial sectors are allowed to operate because they were considered important for the response to the pandemic. The share of natives employed in these sectors that were allowed to work during the lockdown is higher than the share of immigrants that were allowed to work, that were employed in sectors that were allowed to work during the lockdown. Okay, so this is basically, there is somehow a contrast between the higher concentration in essential occupations and the lower concentration in sectors that were allowed to operate during the lockdown, which again suggests that immigrants may have suffered more than natives due to the pandemic crisis. So now here's the key question, how has the COVID-19 crisis affected immigrants? And one way of starting to address this question is to look at what is the share of workers that were employed during the first semester of 2019 and were still employed in the first semester 2020. Okay, the first semester 2020 has been affected by COVID for at least 4 months, 4.5 months to some extent, out of 6. So out of 100 Italians who had a job during the first 6 months of 2019, 95 still had a job during the first half of 2020. This share is 91 among migrants. Men are more likely to be still in employment. So 96% of Italian men and 93% of the immigrant men that were employed in the first half of 2019 still have a job in 2020. But the biggest gap is among women. Okay, so not only Italian women are less likely to still have a job, Italian women that were employed in 2019 are less likely to still have a job in 2020, but the share of immigrant women that were employed in 2019 and still have a job in 2020 is much lower, is 88.6%. Okay, so this is already a first indication that tells us that immigrants may have suffered more because of the COVID, and immigrant women may particularly suffer. Of course, this is just the first indication, but it's not the whole story, because there are perhaps in general so there is a higher share of immigrants that have temporary contracts. So in general, it is likely that women are less likely to retain their job than natives. So it is not certain that these figures look like that because it's 2020 and not because in general, immigrants have a lower job retention than natives. So to get a fuller picture, what we can do is to look at differential in employment probability between immigrants and natives and see how they have evolved over time. In particular, we can compare the gap in employment probability between immigrants and natives in the first semester 2019 with a gap in employment probability between immigrants and natives in the first semester 2020. That's what we do in this graph here. So this graph reports for each quarter since quarter 1 2018 until quarter 2 2020, the immigrant native gap in employment probability expressed in percentage points. Okay, so as you can see, there is a pretty clear seasonality. The gap are larger in the first and the fourth quarter and smaller in the second and third quarter in general. However, if we focus on the period, so if we compare the first 2 quarters of 2019 with the first 2 quarters of 2020, we see how the gap has substantially increased from minus 1.5 percentage point to minus 4 percentage points. So the gap has widened by 2.5 percentage point. And actually, if we were to focus on the quarter 2, the increase in the gap would be even larger. If we then look at the gender dimension that the previous data were indicating as relevant, we see that the whole increasing gap is entirely driven by the worsening of employment probability of immigrant women relative to Italian women. So the gap in employment probability of immigrant women was 4.2 percentage points in 2019. The gap has then increased to 8 percentage points during the first 2 quarters of 2020. In contrast, the gap among men has not significantly changed. Okay, actually, there's not even a gap. In general, immigrant men are more likely to be employed relative to Italian men, but this gap, this differential has remained almost stable between the first 2 quarters of 2019 and the first 2 quarters of 2020. Another dimension of heterogeneity that we can explore is the geographic heterogeneity. So what we report here is the change in the immigrant native gap in employment probability between 2019 and 2020 by region, okay? And the red scattered horizontal line reports the average Italian figure. So we know that that's 2.5 percentage point. We've seen that earlier. What this graph shows is that there is geographic heterogeneity, okay? And in particular, the regions where the increase in the employment gap was largest were Sardinia, Calabria, Sicily, Campania, so are southern Italian regions. Okay, Lombardia is the only, is the first, or actually is the northern region with the largest gap, but it's not much larger than the increase in gap that has been experienced on average by the whole of Italy. So why do we see this geographic pattern? One potential explanation is suggested by this graph here. So in this graph, we're plotting on the vertical axis the pandemic-induced differential in employment probability. So again, by the amount of percentage point increase in the immigrant native difference in employment probability between 2019 and 2020 against the share of immigrants that are employed in an elementary occupation in that region before the pandemic, okay? And the graph shows pretty clearly that there is a strong negative correlation between these two variables, indicating that in regions where migrants are more likely to perform low-skilled occupations that are also less paid and typically less protected, they are also more likely to have suffered more negative consequences because of the pandemic. Okay, so my time is running up, so I'm just concluding. And something I'd like to note here is that I focused here only on employment probability, okay? So, and actually the reason why all the results I presented are about employment probability is because we have looked at other outcomes, so like wages, type of occupations, but there is almost no effect, at least in the short run, on these other labor market outcomes, okay? Except for women in some cases, but the most striking effect is on employment probability. So perhaps effects on wages or on the occupational quality may emerge in the longer run, but in the short run, so like basically 4 months into the pandemic, we don't have any evidence of that. Still, we have this particularly worrying effect on employment probability, and the effect is particularly worrying because for many migrants, the residence permit is tightly linked to employment. So the loss of employment may lead for many migrants to the impossibility of renewing their job permit, and therefore may lead them to lose legal status and fall into irregularity, which increases their marginality, makes their social and economic integration more difficult, and adds to the fact that immigrants have on average limited access to a safety net provided by family or friends relative to natives. So this further increases the risk of economic and social marginalization, which is particularly worrying because marginality is always a bad thing, but if it is even linked to this ethnic dimension, it becomes it may become even more dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tommaso.
Okay, let me stop.
I ask you to give me back the camera. Thank you. Thanks, Tommaso, for this very clear, comprehensive, and gloomy picture. I think it's very important. We don't have questions in the Q&A, so I think we can move straight to my few concluding remarks before ending this very interesting conference. We had a very dense afternoon. I will not comment on each paper, of course. I will just try to sum up in a way to find some common thread among what we have discussed this afternoon. And in trying to do this, I gave this title, The Disintegrating Impact of a Pandemic. I hope these few final thoughts can show some path for future interdisciplinary, in particular, efforts, because we should remind that one of the reasons for this collaboration between Collegio Carlo Alberto, FIERI, and Luca Dagliano, who is in the first line, of course, in this exercise, is to foster interdisciplinary thinking. And I think that when facing such a dramatic, encompassing global, horizontal, exogenous shock as the pandemic, interdisciplinary dialogue and thinking and innovative thinking, as if possible, as we have seen, for instance, with the development of the concept of systemic resilience by Ruhs and his colleagues, is particularly needed. My first point in trying to do this is that what we have discussed today is alarming. The fifth report of Luca Dagliano Centro is indeed a loud and clear and powerful alarm call on the impact of the pandemic on immigration and immigrants. We knew already that systemic crises tend to hit migrants more heavily, and we knew that also from previous editions of the annual report of the Migration Observatory. Also, the Great Recession in particular, 10 years ago, was a MIG session or MIG recession, very clearly. And now this is compounded by the asymmetrical effects of this current exogenous shock. But this time with some key differences from the point of view of migrant household. The impact was much quicker. There was less time to adapt than 10 years ago. The impact was much more global. And so the escapes to the impact of the shock were not available or less available, meaning secondary migration, re-emigration towards another destination, or return, were in most cases not real solutions, and also buffers, shock absorbing devices such as remittances, as was shown by Ashish, Shenoy, amongst others, were not as effective as they used to be in previous, less global crises. And finally, as was shown very effectively by Tommaso right now, this was not like previous Great Recession, a men's session. So it did not hit primarily males, men workers, but mostly female women. So what some call a she session, even though this is controversial because there was a very interesting discussion on this point between Jacopo, Mazza, and Tommaso in the first session of our meeting. But of course, it's clear from the figures that were presented by Tommaso that care work was very heavily hit, even though it is often essential, it's not remotable, and in particular, it's very little guaranteed by social protection. And so this is certainly among the factors explaining this asymmetrical nature of the impact by gender. A second point is that this is not a pandemic. What do I mean by this? This is a quote by a very interesting editorial by the prestigious medical journal, The Lancet, who says this is not a pandemic. What do they mean by this? Because the impact is indeed universal, but as we have seen across all these very interesting presentations, the impact is not homogeneously distributed, it's highly differentiated. And a word to grasp these variations and the crucial role of context in shaping the impact of the pandemic, concept has been proposed by medical anthropology and critical epidemiology. It is the concept of syndemic, where syn, the prefix syn, hints at the synergy, at negative synergies affecting, in particular, as we will see, migrants. I quote from the anthropologist who introduced this concept in the international debate, Merrill Singer. He says that, he writes that concentration and deleterious interaction of two or more diseases or other health conditions in a population, especially as a consequence of social inequity and the unjust exercise of power. So it's not just about comorbidity, but it's about the synergy between morbidity of different types and other profiles of disadvantage and possibly discrimination. To put it more generally, quoting from an editorial of The Lancet a couple of years ago, and there is an ongoing, very interesting debate on the concept of syndemic on this mainly medical journal. Syndemic is a conceptual framework, so it's not a full-fledged theory for understanding how health conditions are exacerbated by the social, economic, environmental, and political milieu in which a population is immersed, and the other way around, how social conditions are exacerbated by health conditions. We have seen this very clearly in most of our presentations this afternoon, and I think that this concept is particularly useful in summarizing and framing precisely these interactions. And in public health literature, indeed, immigration and the related weaknesses that have been listed, including just now by Tommaso, so precarity, prejudice, weak legal protection, fragility of administrative status, so the risk of loss of status, often emerge as a key element of syndemic figurations. And this is obviously the case also this time with this particular syndemic figuration that is emerging in the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, let me try and draw this to some consideration on the policy response. My argument is that these disintegration processes are largely neglected in the policy debate, in the public debate, while we see this as a continuous trend. Of course, there is an acceleration in these disintegration trends that has been portrayed very effectively by today's presentations and by the report, but this is continuing since a few years. If you have a look at the previous LDA reports, you see it clearly. So what we see is a double movement. On the one hand, we have a pauperization of immigration, especially in some European countries. This is very clear in Southern Europe, but not only. I mean, it's a Europe-wide, probably a global trend, and this is reflected in a corresponding trend towards ethnicization of poverty and a growing identification of poverty, of the condition of poverty, including with phenotypical aspects and with the associated risk of racism that is embedded in this double movement. And what we notice, I think, is a certain degree of public resistance to acknowledge these trends, to tackle these trends in the public debate, to recognize the structural nature of these trends and the systemic danger they represent. The danger of increasingly segmented societies along ethnic lines and origin lines, and possibly also color lines. What about the policy response? The policy response is precisely for the reason that there is not enough framing, not enough acknowledgement, is insufficient at all levels. In particular, if we look now at the main policy, European-wide policy response to the pandemic, so the Next Generation EU plan, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the peculiar condition of immigrants and ethnic minorities is insufficiently recognized in Next Generation EU, and reversing these disintegration trends is not explicitly identified as one of the overarching goals of Next Generation EU, not at the European level, even less so in national debates, where these segments of the population have notoriously little voice and little possibility to influence in the current discussion on the allocation of Next Generation EU funding. To conclude, I hope that, well, I'm sure that LDA, Luca Dagliano efforts in this area with the annual report supported by Collegio Carlo Alberto and in cooperation with FIERI are important in the Italian context at least, but maybe not only, to raise awareness in this area and to push forward knowledge, in particular interdisciplinary knowledge in this field. And I hope that this endeavor will continue in the next few years. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for listening. I give back the floor to Tommaso for a final word. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks Ferruccio for this very interesting, so for taking stock so nicely of all the papers that have been presented today. And I would just like to thank everyone. I'd like to thank all the speakers who have presented their papers today and all the participants to this workshop. And I hope that I can, the next year we can replicate this live in person, because like Zoom workshops are nice, but I think in-person interaction is still better. But I think this has been a fruitful afternoon. So thank you again, and have a nice weekend, everyone. And sorry, let me also thank again, once again, Chiarelli for and all the administrative staff at the Collegio Carlo Alberto for organizing smoothly the conference. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.